This isn't just a trade disagreement anymore. In the past 48 hours, Donald Trump has escalated tensions with Canada in a way that goes beyond trade or tariffs. What started as routine policy threats has now turned into something far more dangerous, with the U.S. president openly mocking Canadian culture, threatening to strip away Canada's beloved ice hockey, and making outlandish claims about tariffs. But here's the twist. Behind the bizarre comments and the headlines, this is a direct challenge to Canadian sovereignty, and Canada is responding with fury. Prime Minister Carney, the provincial premiers, and the Canadian people are standing firm. They've had enough. And here's where it gets interesting. This isn't just about trade deals or military jets. This is about something much bigger. Canada is facing a true test of its national identity, and what happens next could change the relationship between these two nations forever. Do you want to know why? Stay with me. What makes this moment different is how fast it's moving and how much is being said without being fully explained. In just 2 days, the U.S. president publicly warned that if Canada deepens trade with China, it could face 100% tariffs. At a public appearance, he said Canada could lose ice hockey if it goes down that path. At the same time, his administration floated a separate threat. If Canada doesn't purchase American F-35 fighter jets, the United States could pull out of NORAD defense arrangements. On the surface, these look like disconnected outbursts. Trade here, defense there, a joke that sounds like a meme, but notice the pattern forming. Trade pressure, military leverage, cultural ridicule, all aimed at the same country, all inside a 48-hour window. And here's the question that reframes everything. If this were just negotiation, why does it sound like punishment? Why stack tariffs, defense threats, and public humiliation all at once? Because this is where the story flips. Here's the first hard proof that this isn't random. When asked directly about reports of U.S. officials engaging with separatist groups inside Canada, Prime Minister Carney didn't dodge. Standing at the podium in Ottawa, he said he expects the U.S. administration to respect Canadian sovereignty, adding that he has been very clear about that directly with President Trump. That line matters because leaders don't talk about sovereignty unless they believe it's being tested. And notice what Carney didn't do. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't frame it as a misunderstanding. He drew what he called a bright line. Then the tone shifted even further. British Columbia Premier David Eby went on camera and said that crossing the border to solicit a foreign government to break up Canada was, in his words, treasonous activity. He didn't hedge. He didn't soften it. He said it should be called out and stopped. That's not activist language, that's crisis language. And here's the detail nobody can ignore. Not one U.S. official publicly denied the allegation. No clarification, no walk back, just silence. And that silence sets up the escalation that comes next. Once that word entered the conversation, everything accelerated. Because when multiple premiers from different parties start using language like treasonous, it signals they believe this is no longer hypothetical. Ontario Premier Doug Ford didn't just criticize the idea of back-channel talks with the U.S. On camera, he called them unacceptable and warned that Canada was under attack. His message was blunt. United, we stand. Divided, we fall. This is where the comparison quietly changes. Not to an academic precedent, not to some distant Cold War analogy, but to a very modern playbook. Pressure doesn't arrive as tanks at the border. It arrives as trade threats, defense dependency, and encouragement of internal fracture. Slowly at first, then all at once. And watch what's being normalized. A U.S. administration suggesting it could fly F-35 jets over Canadian territory whenever it wants. A defense alliance framed as leverage, sovereignty treated as conditional. That shouldn't sound normal, but it's being said out loud. And here's the part that sharpens the tension. While premiers were condemning this publicly, the spotlight turned to the one province where separatist groups actually exist, Alberta. Because this is where the story tightens and where the pressure suddenly becomes very personal. When Alberta came into focus, the room changed. Because this wasn't abstract anymore. These separatist movements weren't theoretical. They were real groups operating inside a real province, while senior figures in Washington were openly talking about Alberta as a natural partner for the United States. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on camera and said there were rumors about a referendum on Alberta leaving Canada. He didn't shut it down. He didn't dismiss it. He let it hang. And that's the contradiction that changes how you see this. While Canadian leaders were drawing red lines, U.S. officials were casually floating the idea of breaking the country apart. Then came the pressure point. Reporters turned to Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and asked her directly how she would respond. On camera, she said she expected the U.S. administration to respect Canadian sovereignty and that she would raise the issue with her delegates in Washington and Ottawa. Notice what's missing. No condemnation of the separatists, no rejection of U.S. involvement, just process. And this is where the story flips again, because silence at this moment isn't neutral. It creates space. And space is exactly what pressure campaigns need to grow, which raises the next question. What happens when this pressure doesn't stay political and starts hitting people's lives directly? While the political fight plays out on camera, something else is happening underneath it. The pressure is starting to move from words to consequences. Canada is now reviewing its future purchases of American military equipment, specifically the F-35 fighter jets, not as a bargaining chip, as a risk assessment. Here's the concrete detail that changes everything. Countries that buy F-35s become dependent on the United States for software updates, maintenance, and repairs. Denmark learned that the hard way. If access is cut off, the aircraft don't just degrade, they effectively stop functioning. So when Canadian officials hear threats about defense agreements being reconsidered, they don't hear bluster, they hear leverage. That's why Canada is openly looking at alternatives like Sweden's Gripen jets, with discussions about building them inside Canada itself. And notice how fast this escalated. One moment it's tariffs, then it's fighter jets, then it's NORAD, then it's internal separatist talk. This isn't slow pressure, it's stacked pressure. And here's the unsettling part. Once defense dependency becomes a tool, every decision after that is made under threat. So ask yourself this: if Canada steps away, what does the response look like? And if it doesn't, what does it lose? What happens if this continues? Now bring this down to where it actually lands. Not in Ottawa, not in Washington, with ordinary people. Because when tariffs jump to 100%, that's not a headline. That's prices. When a 50% tariff is threatened on Canadian aircraft like Bombardier jets, that's not abstract policy. That's jobs, supply chains, entire towns tied to aerospace manufacturing. If defense agreements become leverage, that doesn't just affect generals. It affects border security, emergency response, airspace safety, things you don't think about until they wobble. And when political leaders start talking about provinces breaking away, that uncertainty seeps into everything. Investment pauses. Businesses hesitate. People start asking questions they've never had to ask before. This is why Canadian premiers keep repeating the word unity, not as a slogan, as damage control. And here's the detail that matters most. None of this requires a single law to change overnight. The pressure alone does the work. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because once uncertainty becomes normal, it stops feeling like a crisis. And that's when systems quietly shift without permission, which brings us to the mechanism that makes all of this possible. What makes this work isn't chaos, it's structure. Pressure like this succeeds because it exploits incentives, not emotions. Trade threats create urgency. Defense dependency creates fear of vulnerability. Public ridicule creates distraction. And internal fracture creates plausible deniability. No single move crosses a red line, but together they bend the field. That's the mechanism mainstream coverage keeps missing. Power doesn't need to announce itself anymore. It just needs leverage points, supply chains, security systems, political fault lines. Once those are identified, influence becomes quiet and continuous. Look at the incentives. Canada is told it can trade freely, but only with approved partners. It can defend itself, but only with equipment that requires foreign permission to function. It can debate its future, but only as long as that debate stays domestic. The moment it doesn't, the pressure arrives. This isn't about one leader or one administration. It's about a system where dependence replaces consent, where sovereignty exists on paper, but decisions are shaped elsewhere. And here's the unsettling insight. Once this model works on one country, it becomes reusable, which is why the next move matters more than the last one, because the trajectory is already forming and it doesn't pause on its own. From here, the path splits, but neither option is clean. One trajectory is restraint. Canada absorbs the pressure, keeps negotiations open, avoids public escalation, and bets that this moment burns out. Trade threats remain threats. Defense leverage stays implicit. The noise fades, but the dependencies stay exactly where they are. The other trajectory moves faster. Canada deepens partnerships elsewhere. Trade with China expands despite the warnings. Defense procurement shifts away from the United States. Domestic manufacturing becomes a strategic priority, not an economic one. The relationship with Washington doesn't collapse, but it fundamentally changes. And here's the key detail that makes this unstable. Both paths create momentum. Choosing restraint signals tolerance, choosing diversification signals defiance. Neither choice is neutral, and both force a response. Notice what's already happening. Tariffs are being floated before deals are finalized. Separatist rhetoric is surfacing before any referendum exists. Military leverage is discussed before any purchase decision is made. The moves are anticipatory, not reactive. That tells you something important. This isn't about what Canada has done. It's about what Canada might do next. And when pressure starts being applied preemptively, it usually means the next escalation is already being prepared, which brings us to the final question this story leaves hanging. Strip away the noise, and one truth sits underneath all of it. This wasn't triggered by a single trade deal or a speech at Davos or even a tariff threat. It was triggered by independence. The moment Canada signaled it could make major economic and strategic decisions without permission, pressure arrived from every direction at once. That's the insight that reframes everything you've just watched. Power today doesn't always say no. Sometimes it says yes and then quietly raises the cost of choosing differently. Tariffs here, defense leverage there, a joke that lands like a warning, a silence that speaks louder than denial. And here's the part that should stick with you. None of this requires invasion. None of it requires laws to change overnight. It only requires enough uncertainty to make independence feel risky. Canada's response so far has been unity, calm language, clear lines. But this story isn't finished, because the real test isn't what leaders say at podiums. It's what happens when the next decision has consequences attached to it. That decision is coming. And when it does, it won't just define Canada's future. It will show how power works in the modern world. If you want to understand what happens next and why stories like this keep repeating, follow and subscribe. This isn't the end of this story. It's the beginning of the next layer.